Cool. Thanks everyone for coming. I believe you had your lunch and I keep you awake. The topic for today is demystifying game production. What's there to demystify? What attempt is to basically simplify game production. Now, just trying to basically do a quick check on how many people here are already in production, already working as producers in games. Can you please raise your hand? Okay, and how many people aspire to get into production? I don't believe half of this crowd. Cool. So yeah, the whole idea, production is a little unique to gaming, right? Like other functions like engineering and product managers kind of basically find similarities, like parallels in other industry, but like in gaming, production is very unique. Plus, production from company to company is very unique in its own sense. So we'll kind of basically try to touch on some commonalities, which kind of basically drive production. Uh, to start with, let's start with a quick introduction. The previous one wasn't right. I'm not into this for more than 50 years. I've been here in production, doing production for 20 years. I started in year 2000. I started in Mumbai, co-founded a gaming company. And since then, I've worked with like a lot of studios, some of the great studios like EA, Zynga, Rockstar, Dhruva. Um, and my experience has taken me across platforms. So I had the fortune of working on AAA titles, mobile titles, like next generation VR stuff, web. So it's across. I also have like one of those guys who's basically worked on the services side as well as the product side. So yeah, quite a lot of coverage in terms of my own production experience. And what I have sensed is no two places kind of runs the production environment in the same way. So yeah, please hold on to your questions till the very end. I know there are few people who are really curious to ask questions. Cool. So yeah, first let's basically get the disclaimer out of the way. All right. Whatever I express here are my views, not my current employers or my past employers. And let's start with like an initial dive into production. This is basically what we normally see, right? Like the production phases of the production pipeline. You start with ideation, you take it to production and post-production. At the ideation stage, what you're trying to do is build up the idea, kind of basically get to a spec. Could be like getting to a one-pager or a game design document. Then you kind of basically get to the production phase. The production phase is when you are engaging the biggest cohort of of all the functions working together, and then there is post-production. I'll be kind of sliding through this. We'll be touching on the various pipeline aspect of productions later. But let's basically go to the most controversial question here. What does a game producer do? Okay, and you kind of basically get a lot of version. Like anyone can be a game producer. Like they don't absolutely do anything. So let's basically touch on few of the things that I keep hearing. Maybe the first one would be trying to basically answer, what does a game producer do? They are the party organizers, arrange cakes, okay, conduct all hands, or if someone is really nice, they'll say, oh, they're the firefighters, facilitators, the people who love Jira. No one loves it, but they do. Or, like a little more serious. Oh, like voice of the game team. This is the guy who kind of basically talks for us. These are the guys who kind of basically manage the scope, manage the schedule, cost. They're the project managers. And you kind of keep hearing a lot of different versions. Like if you expand it further, they kind of get involved in roadmap planning, capacity planning, operational management. At the very end, I would like to basically say the most important thing right at the top is the producers are the voice of the player. And I'll try to basically connect this too. But I think, like I have the best version of what a producer does. And I think you guys will agree with this. That's the game producer. And with his backlog, trying to basically free the world. Cool. So yeah, since we are sticking on definitions and you're trying to basically explore what what is game production, even I kind of basically went searching for, is there like a definition for a game producer? Well, apparently in 1983, Trip Hawkins, who's the founder of EA, kind of basically formulated a definition, and this is what I've picked from Wikipedia. So producers basically manage the relationship with the artist, I mean with the teams. They find talent, work on product deals, get contracts signed, manage them, bring them to their conclusion. The producers do most of the things that a product manager does. Okay, now this is 83. They don't do the marketing. Who likes doing marketing? Which is in some cases, product managers do. They don't make decisions about packaging and merchandising, but they do get involved. They are a little bit like a book editor, a little bit like a film producer, a lot like a product manager. So this is like a definition from 83. Obviously, like the industry has evolved leaps and bounds, but you still see these synergies, right? Like someone kind of not absolutely saying that, like producers are project managers or producers are this, like they're a bit of everything. Further, we kind of basically analyze, and this is my thing. What happened? Okay. So yeah, well, like my way of looking at the three touch points where the producers basically get involved. In the entire game ecosystem, producers kind of work and are the common link between the product, people, and processes. All you're doing is for the player and your business ecosystem. This further kind of basically would like to take you to the question you essentially ask, right? Like when you kind of basically looking at the entire game ecosystem, you would like to basically ask what. So when you're like on the product side, you would like to basically own up what, like what does the player want? Okay, what could be my, what can I do to improve my D7 retention? What could I do to basically increase my engagement? And then you have the people side, which basically curiously keeps asking why, right? We must have all experienced our engineers. Why are we doing this? Okay, there's no need for doing this. Why are you prioritizing this over that? Okay, so that's the people sense, the people area, the people question. What connects it all is the process, which tries to basically answer how. So yeah, when you have a great idea, you know what you want to basically give to the player, you know how you are going to prioritize it, but how it's all going to come together, how we kind of basically going to take it forward is what the entire ecosystem and producers, game producers work across all of this. So I would say in certain versions, maybe how is the responsibility aspect of a game producer, whereas like what and why could be the accountability aspect of their work. We'll further use these questions to basically get to some decision making later, but like just hold on to this. Now again, like we hear there are a lot of producers, right? Like kind of basically there are prefix and suffix, like you have game producers on live ops, art producers, tech producers, audio producers. So what I'm trying to get to is producers not just defined as one function. Like you could be basically managing certain operations. Say you kind of basically do managing a live ops game. So it's live ops operations, right? Or you could basically be doing an absolute new game, right? Which could be a project. And that's what eventually leads us to basically see what are the skills that we are talking about. So we go back to the people, process, product domains, and then we see, okay, as people, for people, you manage people, you do the cakes and the parties, you do the team composition. What are you using? What is the skill that is getting called off for? Like your domain skills, your leadership skills, how much do you know about stuff? On the process side, you could be basically managing operations or project. In this example, I'm kind of basically building up a project management skill set. On the product side, you could basically be doing the quality, playability, be the champion for the player, doing the roadmap. So all of it kind of basically, like declassifies, and that's what I want to basically get to my next slide. So if you have to understand, like what does a producer do in terms of the hard skill aspect. So many a times, and this is what I always say, like looking at project management or product management as a hard skill, essential hard skills, depending on what is the domain that you get catering to, what does like your company want you as a producer. You could be basically be focusing on the operations bit, you could be focusing on the project bit, you could be focusing on the domain centric. You have tech producers, you have creative producers. So that becomes the essential hard skill element of your production system. And then obviously you need those strong soft skills. You basically would like to lead with example. You gonna have good collaboration, adaptability, good conflict management, etc. What I'll do here is basically just have like a touch point on one of the hard skill, that is project management. And then, like, so as we've seen, on one of the hard skills, we basically have project management. It's it's almost important for every producer to basically really understand and be invested in the project life cycle, right? This is the phases that a project goes through. Like you start with initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and control, and closing, which is like a constant loop. We'll work on it, we'll build on it. Now we kind of do talk about the traditional cycle and the adaptive cycle. In the adaptive cycle, or what we say agile, kind of basically go through the entire process on multiple iterations. We'll build onto this as we move on. But essentially what I feel is project management by itself is the study of these 10 knowledge areas, which is vast in its own way. You kind of basically uh, integrate the project, you kind of do the scope management, time management, cost management, quality management, procurement in some cases, communication management, risk management, and stakeholder management. Now, by itself, these domains, like you could basically build an expertise, like spend a life and like be a subject matter expert in one of these, and you could basically do an amazing job. But these are what essentially you manage as producers. And moving to the next slide, I would like to basically connect the soft and the hard aspect of a producer's life or a project manager's life in that instance. So we've been talking about constraints. These are 6 constraints out of the 10 knowledge areas that we saw, which are kind of basically called constraints. You hear a lot about triple constraints. Here I have 6. Uh, the reason we call them constraints, because they're interrelated, right? Like you change one, you have like your resource change, your cost is going to basically be impacted. Your scope is going to get impacted. Like your time is going to get impacted. You have something change in the ecosystem. It's going to basically impact. So your change management always relies and revolves around these 6 constraints. And of the 10 knowledge areas, these are the most that you kind of work on a day-to-day basis. I would like to basically connect the soft aspect, like we all producers kind of basically on a regular basis do a lot of conflict management, right? You would have a designer basically wanting to change the spec and do, like some changes where your engineers going to freak out and you're like, no, we're not going to touch about it. We're not going to do it. On the surface, it always feels like, like the bias kicks in and it always feels like it's a personality clash. Like you want to bring some change and no one is going to expect. But the moment you dig deeper, you kind of basically see most of the times you find that people aren't aligned on one of these constraints. So a designer might basically be worried about quality, whereas the engineer might be super worried about introducing more risk or kind of basically changing the time. So, like just bringing that element of alignment helps basically solve a lot of these conflicts. And you kind of don't basically get to the bias part of basically running to a conclusion that it's an ego clash or a personality clash, etc. Now, like further going down on the project, many a times I do get asked this question, like, oh, what is waterfall? What is agile? What is the best way of basically managing your project. Why should we basically do, like, why shouldn't we do agile? Why shouldn't we do Scrum? Why should my way of looking at project management for game production is these methodologies are what you need for your project. If you're building a new game, a iterative game, where the need for iteration is a lot more, maybe agile is the good process to go with. But like you kind of basically doing a steady state. Like you already know what you're going to do. Maybe waterfall solves the problem. Like the analogy I give for the method best used for your production is basically looking at all these methods as different variants of cricket, right? You have the T20, you have the test matches, you have your gully cricket. Well, what is common? The aspect that is common is it's all cricket. And you kind of deploy it in different senses to solve different problems. So the method you choose for your production always depends on what works best for you. So that's touching on the method. Now, like beyond this, and I didn't want to basically make it like all project manager because, like as I say, producers are not just project managers. But one thing all producers do is basically make a lot of decisions. So the next aspect is basically picking up framework. I don't know how many of you have heard of the OODA framework. Can you please raise your hand? Okay, not many. So the framework was basically designed for, like by John Boyd. Like it was done for the military, and like it helped them, like strategize quick action on the military basis. Now it is used everywhere. It's a decision-making phenomena that kind of basically, or a framework that kind of basically gets used time and again. And this is what kind of basically divides, and this is something that we all do as producers. So we start with observe, we orient, we decide, and act. That's what OODA stands for. And this you do to make quick decisions, the right decisions. Now, like kind of basically building up on each of these 4 phases. Let's basically start with observe. And we're kind of picking up, analogy which I've borrowed from Shiv. He's sitting here. So, like it's the Doctor Strange analogy, kind of basically trying to look at your game as a human body. And how do you basically set your observations? So first thing you do is try to basically see what, like if you're kind of basically analyzing a human body or a doctor is analyzing a human body, one could be either ailing, okay, he has some kind of sickness, he's sick, like he's coughing, he has cold, he has shivers, etc., etc. The other could be functioning. Yeah, well, like just about living around. Enhancing, someone who's really basically doing better, like his reports are great, he's in good shape, he's kind of one who basically runs 5 kilometers at least once in a week. And living, someone who's at the Zen mode, like all the reports are good, he's at its best fitness, etc. Now we try to basically see that observation. Okay. We try to basically do this observation, like at a little depth. Like you try to see state of the human or the game analogy, right? So we kind of basically putting a game and a human next to each other and saying, oh, like if he's ailing, what he needs medical test. He might have critical needs. On a game, maybe the game is crashing on certain devices. Okay, like you kind of basically have made a release and the game is crashing on certain devices, on certain platforms. Could be functioning. Like as a person, you are doing well. Like at the game level, the game is at its cadence. It kind of basically consumes the regular feature. Everything kind of is hunky-dory there. At enhancing, the game hasn't been doing really good. Okay, and like your features are working, your bold beats are working. Like your focus is more on optimizing the game, reaching new audiences, etc. At living, like you're at the Zen mode, right? So what you kind of been focusing there is innovations, creative expressions, etc. Just to remind you, we're still basically talking about the OODA framework, We are at the observe part of it. And this is where we start basically seeing the sense. So if you have to basically check for your game needs, okay, game is ailing, it's broken, it's unstable, it's kind of basically freezing on certain devices. And this is the current situation you are in. You would not like to be observing your player wish list, your business goals, etc. What you need for this moment would definitely be focusing on the game metric, looking at your CS reports, looking at your reviews, trying to basically debug. So that's kind of basically the data you would like to observe. In terms of basically the data that you look at, you could basically be looking at any of this data, and like in case of human, you would basically go for a red blood count, white blood count. You kind of basically are trying to diagnose. Similarly, on a game, you would be trying to basically figure out your, like your DAUs, your, like if there is a drop, like if there is a freeze on a release, your DAU is going to drop for that particular week or a day, etc. So this part, being able to look at the right data, to be able to associate with the right problem, is the observe part of the OODA framework. Next, what we move to is orienting yourself, making sure that you're oriented in the right direction. You've kind of basically seen your data, you've seen your observation, you've seen, say if you have to take some example, game freeze is one example that I gave, like on release, the game freezes. The other example could be a new game, right? And before the release, you've kind of basically been seeing that the play test quality isn't that great. What's happening there, right? You could basically get data in terms of saying, oh, there's a lot of bugs. And then you dig deeper and you're like, oh, we're getting a lot of bugs on UX or art. So you're like, that's the part where you start orienting and you use the data that you've gathered to further analyze. You kind of basically do a RCA, like this 5 why technique, kind of keep asking yourself why. You start, oh, like, why do I have so many UX bugs? What is happening there? Oh, like one of the plugins that we've been using for Unity isn't working for us. That's basically creating a lot of ZDF issues, for example. So, like you kind of basically orient yourself in the direction that basically helps you solve the problem. Like ideally they say 5 why, but you kind of keep asking these whys till you basically get an answer, which kind of orients you into the right direction. There are other techniques. Say if you're kind of basically looking at a product view and you're doing a competitive analysis, you could basically be doing a SWOT analysis at this point and trying to figure out what is working for the competitor, which is not working for us, and so on. So this is the analyze. You have the data, you basically are kind of applying certain tools and techniques to analyze this further. This is basically the fishbone method of trying to do a RCA in terms of trying to figure out which environmental factor is. So you observe, you orient, you kind of basically get the right direction, you start looking at the right way, you now know the problem statement much better, and then comes, let's decide what needs to do. Ultimately, it's a decision-making framework, and you would want to decide. Now, this is where I bring back those questions, right? The whats, the whys, and the how. Ideally, you would like to basically be making a decision by responding to the situation rather than reacting to it, right? So this is basically in terms of prioritization. Say if you're talking about bugs here, you're talking about anything, you want to basically reach a decision in a responsive manner, in a preempted manner with the least iterations. So like your observation, your orientation, your analysis tries to basically give you that answer to what, how, and what could be the preemptive decision that you would like to be making. And the last phase of this is going and taking action, right? You've kind of basically made a decision, you made a responsive decision, now take action. Now, what do I mean by take action? That is to further test what you've analyzed. You could basically be picking up a new method. If it is a project problem, you could be doing certain prototypes and doing a customer insight, trying to figure out if the prototype works. You be kind of basically doing the A/B testing. Eventually, all you get, all you gather from these tests, from these changes, from these experiments, further becomes a part of your observation, and the cycle continues. So that's about the OODA cycle of decision making. Um, I'm doing good on time. So, like in terms of solid summary that I'd like to basically build on to is no matter, like which organization, what product situation or project situation or production systems that we follow, ultimately our goal is to basically improve efficiency, have speed in our process, do make a positive impact, like make sure you have a happy team and happy players. So that's the end, like that's the last slide. Okay, yeah. Questions? I see Mukund is not here. Great. Any questions? Cool. So, like I still waiting. Any questions?
It was a great presentation, Alok. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My question would be how producers make decisions independently? If not, then how producers can make sure the right decisions can be made and in a faster manner? How producers can help in expediting the decisions, especially in the critical times?
So, like to give a quick example, like I think producers can basically set the right parameters for making sure a right decision gets made. So I always use this analogy where, like say we are in November, we have a Christmas release. You kind of basically are getting into the Christmas release. You have two developers working on it. And you suddenly, like one of the developer has basically asked you for like a 3-day vacation because he wants to attend his sister's wedding. The other developer is available. So you kind of do your calculation. The build is already play tested. It's in the final alpha stage. You've kind of allocated 2 weeks for debugging. Everything is nice, hunky dory. At this point, you realize one of the developers has fallen sick, possibly COVID. He's not going to be around for the next 2 weeks. Now, what do you do? And see, like going back to the decision framework, what you are trying to basically observe, you kind of have a resource situation. Okay, like you had anticipated 20 days. Out of that 20 days, 3 days went away. So you were kind of operating with 17. You are okay with, like, okay, maybe I've lost my buffer, but I can still manage with this. Now you kind of stayed away down to 7-man days, right? So how are you going to work on it? What are the decisions? And that's where, like if your decision framework supports, like you kind of basically use your constraint diagram and say, okay, resources impacted. What are the other things I have, no matter who takes the decision, could be, like your product manager, your executive producer, anyone who kind of basically makes the decision. If you reach that person with a solution saying, this is the situation, our resources have changed, but these are the things that are going to be impacted. Maybe what we can do is basically not, like the first temptation everyone has is like, oh, this guy who's kind of basically taken a 3-day leave, cancel his leave. But do you really want to basically do that? Do you want to further analyze it? So yeah, well, like you would be basically looking at those constraints and like, okay, maybe I can take a little more risk. Maybe we can just basically focus on P0s and P1s, like in terms of debugging. And like live with it. We may have a release, we may know there's certain things broken, but these guys are gonna be back. We may basically always do a next release. So, like if you approach people with this ideology, with this solution, as a producer, no matter whether you have the ability to make the decision or someone else is going to make that decision, it aids because you've applied a certain method for that decision. Hopefully that answers your.
Thanks, Alok. It actually answers another question which I had, but it already answered. Now, how a producer can be more than a thermometer and can be a thermostat rather.
Sorry?
how producer can be a thermostat rather, just a thermometer.
Well, I don't agree with that analogy, but yeah, well,
All right.
Yeah, Alok, I have a question. What are the three most common mistakes producers do? That's one part. Second part is similarly, three most mistakes that they can watch out for. So the second question is three most challenges.
that's a lot of questions. So the first was, like the three mistakes that producers do, right? Well, like in my working, initially when I started my, like producers kind of basically get this fascination of firefighting, right? Like known, to be known as firefighters. Well, what I what I tell everyone is don't aspire to be a firefighter. Though basically people love them, you should be the one making sure that there is no fire in the first place. So that basically becomes the first mistake. The other mistake would be biases. Like how do you basically do your, like how do you put your checks and balances in place, ensure that your communication has a structured management and not basically get into bias of like one example that I gave, wherein like you feel that okay, the conflict is because of a personality or a certain ego. So these are, like some of the mistakes that happen, like on production, you kind of basically are, like aspiring to react quickly, and you don't want to basically use your hard science in trying to either solve a conflict or plan certain things. So I would say these are the common pitfalls one falls in. The other thing is, like don't aspire to be a firefighter. The other thing, like please don't aspire to be a magician as well, right? Like, which happens a lot with producers. Like you might basically go and commit, oh, this could be done in 2 weeks. Okay, like this is my experience. So rather than bringing your, like, okay, we will kind of basically do this magic and like make it happen. One should basically be taking the team into confidence and trying to basically do their structured review in terms of making decisions. So don't be a firefighter, don't be a magician, and keep your biases at check. Do you have more questions, Raju? Like, we can address them in the evening.
I have a question, Alok.
Hi, Deepa.
So there are so many roles that a producer is doing, right? I
Right.
mean, and there may be situations running in parallel. So how do you make your decision which is the topmost priority amongst all?
Well, like I haven't gone at the length of discussing the OODA framework, but it is basically what, like your observation, your analysis, your breakdown kind of basically gives you the direction and prioritization on deciding. It's the what, why, and how triangle that you're trying to always solve. And that is basically which helps you with your prioritization in terms of what kind of, my way of looking at it is least effort and most impact. So if I have to do prioritization, I have to basically stagger things, I might be focusing on that, but it could be different for someone else, right? Maybe, like if you're quality centric, the quality aspect of your product or game could be the highest priority. So, like there's no zero compromise on that. Giving priority to that, trying to make sure that the least effort with the most impact gets basically the highest priority.
Cool. Thank you. It was a really lovely presentation. Love the analogies and
Thank you.
how you put it forward. Thank you.
Any
Any
more
more
questions?
questions? Yeah, one question. Last question we'll take.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Alok. So, how does the role of a game producer change depending on the platform they're working on? Let's say you're on a console on a single player game, and then you're on a mobile, which is a free to play. So, how does the role change?
Well, this could be a very broad question, but it also depends on the organization's product. Like the whole production management system. What you pick, what works best for your organization. Is it basically like a one-man focused production? Is it kind of basically, and then see, like if you remember the hard skill and the soft skill aspect, on the hard skill part, I kind of also included something called as domain knowledge. Now, when I say domain knowledge, it's like what knowledge do you have on certain functions? What are you kind of basically doing with your game? Say, if you're kind of basically building a massively online multiplayer game versus basically a single player game, what is the domain ingredient that's going to change? So it all depends on how you structure your entire production org. It all depends on that. But the ethos, the basic principles remain the same. Like you have to make decisions, you have to manage project. No matter which ecosystem you operate under, these kind of basically stay steady there. And then it's the domain aspect which kind of varies. And that's something, and I did not touch on, like when we talk about hard skills and soft skills, the hard skills are basically your skills that are teachable, right? Something that you can learn, something that you can practice, something that you can really get, read something or do a certification and become good at. Versus the soft skill aspect is your social availability on a particular problem. So, like the hard skills might change depending on what the game changes to, but the overall environment of the production environment, what you're trying to solve, the decisions that you're going to make, your project life cycle, your product life cycle, everything remains the same. So it's just picking up the required domain knowledge, the required functional domain knowledge, and I think rest is all same.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.